Hello and good evening. We now interrupt local broadcasting for breaking news from the Netherlands. In the city of Rotterdam, 3 people, including a 14-year-old girl, were killed by a student gunman. The 32-year-old man opened fire in a residential home, killing a mother and a 13-year-old daughter, after which he set the house on fire. The man then drove to Erasmus University Medical Center, where he entered a classroom and fatally shot a 46-year-old male teacher. After several reports of gunfire, Dutch emergency services responded in large numbers. Medical staff and patients were evacuated from the hospital, while special forces of the Dutch police engaged in a manhunt for the at-large gunman. After some anxious moments, the police were eventually able to apprehend the perpetrator. We now switch to our correspondent live in Rotterdam. Willemijn, can you please explain to us what the current situation is?
Yes, thank you. I'm currently in Rotterdam and the chaos here is unreal. What we know so far is that the shooter is a 32-year-old man who wasn't a stranger to the police. He has had multiple convictions for animal abuse and, according to his neighbors, would show worrying behavior, indicating that he wasn't doing very well. It is believed that the suspect first targeted his neighbor in her house in Rotterdam. 15 minutes after reports of a fire, there were gunshots to be heard, and we now know that these ended the lives of his neighbor and her 14-year-old daughter. He then went to the Erasmus MC and went into the classroom where he shot one of the teachers. He then went on and set part of the hospital on fire. As it turns out, he was mad at the Erasmus MC due to a letter sent by the Dutch Openbaar Ministerie. They had previously sent a letter to the Erasmus MC explaining their worries about this man and wondering whether or not he should be able to receive his basic medical degree. As he was a student here, he felt it was clear that they weren't going to make him a doctor and wanted to take revenge on those who he felt wronged him. For now, he has been arrested and will hopefully hear more soon. Looking at all these signs, it is unreal that nothing was done, resulting in the loss of 3 lives. His neighbor, who dared to speak up, her innocent daughter, and the doctor whom he saw as one of the people holding him back and receiving his degree. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you for your coverage of this horrible event, live from Rotterdam. The terrorist incident in Rotterdam showcases that we currently live in a society full of risk. We are surrounded by threats and risks, and to combat this, there are many preventative measures and mechanisms in place. We try to identify and neutralize any harm that certain individuals or groups can cause to society. However, we have unfortunately seen that not everything can be prevented. To talk more about the society we live in, and how and if we can prevent terrorist attacks, we have invited 2 experts on anti-terrorism measures and legislation. Our first expert is from the Netherlands. Thank you, Anne, for coming onto the show. Now, looking at what happened in Rotterdam and all of the anti-terrorism measures and legislation in the Netherlands, how is someone still able to commit a terrorist attack, like the one in Rotterdam?
Good afternoon. First, I want to share my condolences to the victims and the victims' family, and thank you for inviting me to tell something more about the Dutch legislation. Because of the severe consequences, like the tragedy in Rotterdam, it's important to look at how national legislatures implement their legislation and how this affects society. Indeed, Dutch legislation tries to offer a solution, however, it's from 2019 and could be considered a bit outdated. According to Dutch legislation on terrorism, there's called a list, the National Sanction List of Terrorism, of individuals and organizations who are involved with terrorist activities. When an individual or organization is put on this list, their assets are being frozen in order to make them unable to withdraw money from their bank accounts. The use of credit cards is also prohibited. The reason for this is to stop financial funding of terrorist activities. Consequently, parties who are financially involved in terrorism have significantly more difficulty contributing to or committing terrorist acts. Transferring money by acquaintances is also prohibited. Additionally, the Royal Dutch Air Force monitors the airspace above the Netherlands day and night, and websites that call for hatred, violence or discrimination are being put down. With enemy penology, the aim is to identify and neutralize the enemy in order to prevent harmful consequences. It is an anticipatory and future-oriented concept. Terrorists are an example of these enemies. Terrorists or individuals who are suspected of activities related to terrorism are being put on this list. This way, they are being identified and excluded from society. Jacob Jacobs is critical towards enemy penology. She warns that an adverse consequence could be that people on this list are seen as a non-person. Society sees them as criminals, even though one of them might never have been legally sentenced for any crimes. This closely relates to the concept of othering. Othering can be defined as excluding social minority groups and really see them as the other in a negative way. Often those groups are also being criminalized by the majority groups. Linked to the terrorist list, this means that when an individual is being put on this list, society sees the person as extremely dangerous and a criminal. Another consequence of this is the rise of a risk society. With all these developments in the field of counter-terrorism, such as the lists, the Air Force, and websites being put down, terrorism is being fighted, which is good. However, these implementations could lead to a risk society. This means that societies are increasingly preoccupied with the future and safety and have worries about risk, for example, terrorist attacks. And there's a constant state of worst case scenario thinking, even though these feelings are not always justifiable. Counterterrorism acts thus have a positive and negative consequence. Another consequence of risk society is that the society transforms into a litigious society. In other words, you can be held responsible and culpable for everything. As a result, a crisis of responsibility can occur in which manufactured risk, which is man-made risk, such as terrorism, is so complicated that it's difficult to pinpoint who is responsible for the risk. Well, this is what I wanted to share about my knowledge, and thank you again.
Thank you for your clarification of the Dutch legislation. Many interesting points have been raised, especially connected to the enemy penology, risk society, and othering theory. To have a better understanding of these concepts, and to get a better look on how terrorism is handled in different countries, we've invited a UK expert. Not only does the UK have more recent legislation, but he can also tell us more about the British anti-terrorism legislation that was enacted in 2021. Andre, thank you for coming on the show. Can you explain a bit more how the UK tries to combat terrorism and what instrument your government uses?
Thank you for the opportunity. First of all, I would like to express my deep condolences to all of the victims and their families in Rotterdam. As we can see, reflecting on this incident, we live in a world that is called Risk Society by Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens, a world where we are continuously faced with future risks we do not fully understand, but yet need to respond to them. This is highly related to combating terrorism, where we are constantly faced with the risk of terror, and despite being blurry about the future, the government needs to respond to it. So recently, the UK just introduced a new rule, the Counter-Terrorism and Sentencing Act 2021, whereas in this act, we can clearly see the concept of enemy penology is being used. In this act, people who download or watch information regarding terrorism can end up to a maximum sentence of 15 years, according to Section 58. And another interesting thing about this act is, according to Section 27, for those who are considered as dangerous terrorist prisoner, an early release is no longer an option. However, in Section 244 of the Criminal Justice Act, an early release is a right of all of the offenders. The exception of Section 244 only applies to sex offenders and terrorists. It is so clear that in this act, people are being sentenced to jail way before an actual offense is committed, and the terrorists or suspects, we can say, were being excluded, considered as an enemy and not part of the society. And the last thing I want to talk about in this act is the concept we call othering. So in the bottom part of this act, there's a list of proscribed organization in under the section of Schedule 2, and those who are a member or probably just support or even just wear a uniform of the proscribed organization are subjected to an imprisonment, and those who are involved with terrorism, we can see, are being heavily excluded from the society. And of course, these concepts adopted in the act seems really terrifying and definitely against human rights. However, if we put it on a scale with the risk we are facing from the terrorists, Many would agree that this is a necessary thing to do. It's like the old saying, it is better to be safe than sorry.
I really want to thank you both for your time and interesting points of view. This really helps to have a multi-perspective view on anti-terrorism legislation and measures in different countries around the world. This leaves us with the question whether we should rather be safe than sorry by formulating and enacting anti-terrorism laws. Are the drawbacks of anti-terrorism laws overshadowed by the advantages? And where should the balance be between freedom and security? Is it really a zero-sum game? I'll leave you with that question. This was Jesse, live from London. Good night.